using our time wisely. Regardless of our age, we should use each new day God gives us to live in His will. Here now is Gene Getz.
As you look at this psalm, Psalm 90, this is the only writings of Moses that are included in the Psalms. And as we read through this, you can see it. You can see it as it relates to events that happened in Moses' life. Beginning our reading in verse 3 of Psalm 90. You return mankind to the dust, saying, return descendants of Adam. The fact of the matter is, if you trace back the setting for this psalm, Moses' brother Aaron had just died. And by the way, Aaron was older than Moses. He was 130 when he died. Moses, when he wrote these words, is about 120. He's coming up on his death. But what he is saying is, you return mankind to the dust, saying, return descendants of Adam. For in your sight 1,000 years are like yesterday that passes by, like a few hours of the night. It's fascinating to me that Moses wrote these words when he was about ready to die himself. But he uses the phrase 1,000 years. If you go to one of the epistles of Peter, second epistle, Peter actually talks about the fact that 1,000 years are like a day, and a day like 1,000 years in the sight of God. In other words, God's view of time is totally different than ours. And Moses is recognizing that. Now, he goes on to say here in Psalm 90, verses 10 to 12, again, his perspective on life. Our lives last 70 years. You see, God's perspective on life and death is totally different than ours. But here's Moses' perspective, which we can identify with. Our lives last 70 years, or if we're strong, 80 years. That's fascinating because he's already 120, probably when he wrote this. And he recognizes that God has given him unusual strength, unusual energy. Fascinating thing to me is that the Bible says when he died, at that point in time, his eyes were still as strong as they ever been, his energy. He was a very strong individual, but God took him. And he's looking out at what happens to life generally back then, and he's saying 70 years or 80 years. That's interesting. As I stand before you, I'm thankful that I've gone beyond the 80. But that's only God's grace. That's only God's gift to us in life. He goes on to say, even the best of them are struggle and sorrow. Indeed, they pass quickly, and we fly away. You know, it's rather fascinating because that's a strong theological statement. We fly away. And what he's basically saying is, when you die as a believer or unbeliever, you fly away. You live. You're not, you don't experience annihilation. You live beyond this life. I was thinking there's a Southern gospel song. Used to sing it in a quartet based on this song. Some of you will remember it. Moses' perspective is we fly away at death. And you remember that gospel song that says, some glad morning when this life is o'er, I'll fly away to a home on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away. That song was written based on the words of Moses. Another stanza says, just a few more weary days, and then I'll fly away to a land where joy shall never end. I'll fly away. And there the author picks up the concept of the land, the eternal land, as it were, being eternity. And that grows out of the psalm. And if you compare those words with what is said here by Moses, you can see how this grew right out of the psalm. A lot of songs have grown out of the Psalms. He goes on to say, Who understands the power of your anger? I think that gives us a clue as to the general time frame when Moses wrote this. Because you see, he got so frustrated, both he and Aaron got so frustrated with the children of Israel. And this was, after the wilderness wanderings. This was after God had taken care of them, where they complained that they didn't have water. And God said to Moses, Aaron, speak to the rock and I'll give them water. Well, Moses lost his temper, and what he did was something that God had to deal with, because he said, do we have to bring water out of this rock? We, meaning him and Aaron. Do we have to bring water out of this rock? And he took his rod and he struck it twice in his anger. Now, water came out. But you see, God said to Moses, I'm sorry, Moses, but you and Aaron will not see the promised land, because I can't let you get by with this. It wasn't his anger. God was angry too. It was the fact that he took credit in the presence of the children of Israel for what happened. And they were prone to idolatry anyway and walking away from God. And Moses accepted that. He realized that God couldn't allow that to happen because of this unbelieving group of people, as it were, this rebellious group of people. And so he said, who understands the power of your anger? Your wrath matches the fear that is due you. There, he is accepting that as something that is a reality. I believe he's referring to that event. And he knows the time is coming. And then he says this, which I think is a powerful statement that we can apply to our lives. Teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts. And even at age 120, looking back and looking at his own mistakes, he says, teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts. I think the Apostle Paul adds to Moses' perspective. And that's the beauty of moving from the Old Testament to the New Testament, to see the whole biblical story. And here's what Paul wrote to the Ephesians. Pay careful attention then to how you walk, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time. I believe that correlates with what Moses said. To be careful, to number our days carefully. And he goes on to say, here's the reason. Because the days are evil. So don't be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. And I think if Moses were here and he elaborated on this, he would simply say, yes, I was foolish. I made a serious mistake. I took glory for myself and for my brother, and I should never have done that. And as a result of that, God had to discipline me. But God was righteous in what he did. And so the lesson that comes down to us is, let's not be foolish in the decisions we make, the things that we do, but let's understand what the Lord's will is. So here's a reflection and response question in terms of application. How does Moses and Paul's perspective on getting older differ with the attitude many Christians have regarding retirement? Well, first of all, let me simply say, in relationship to what Paul shared and what Moses shared and what the Bible shares, it doesn't talk about retirement. Now, retirement is not wrong. Retirement can be a great blessing from God. But the fact is that retirement might be the greatest moments of your life to serve God. And let me also add that one of the greatest things you can do as you get older, if God has given you the strength, and that's relative, certainly, because in some instances our bodies deteriorate to the point there's not much we can do. But if we have strength, if our minds are still strong, one of the greatest things we can do in retirement is to stay healthy. Stay healthy physically, with the best we can, and with the great things that God's given us, the gifts of medical science. To stay healthy emotionally, to not be harboring, for example, anger and allowing ourselves to have emotional situations in our lives, to stay healthy emotionally, but most of all, stay healthy spiritually. And these are things I think that God has given us. These are wonderful gifts that God has given us in relationship to our lives today. And we have advantages that a lot of people never had in the past. Even you go back 30 years. You go back 50 years. You go back 100 years to see what God has given us in relationship to the days that we can number as we're growing older. I always get challenged with this. I sat down in the wee hours of the morning one time when I woke up and I was just reflecting. And I sat down, and if I showed you these notes I got all kinds of numbers. And I sort of reflected. And I looked at my present age. And out of all these calculations, I came to the conclusion that if God gave me even half of the life and the strength that my mother had, just half, I would have about 3,000 days to serve Him. And if I had the strength that she had, I could serve Him certainly pretty strongly, because she lived even beyond that. And then I calculated if the Lord gave me the same strength that she had until she died at age 98, I would have, about 6,500 days. Now, basically, I think what the Scripture says, take note of the days that God has given you. Now, we only live a day at a time, and we never know. I used to pray a little prayer, even as a kid growing up. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray thee, Lord, my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray thee, Lord, my soul to take. It's really interesting. As I've gotten older, I lie in bed before I go to sleep, and I prayed that little prayer. Because I never know. I never know. But the fact is that we are to number our days, count our days, the days that God has potentially given us in order to serve Him. Isaac Watts, incredible. Isaac Watts penned poetry for almost all the Psalms except 12. Now think about that. And one of the great poetic pieces that he actually penned is based on this psalm. And the song today, the hymn, is called Our God, Our Help in Ages Past. And it summarizes this psalm. He said, Our God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Under the shadow of thy throne, thy saints have dwelt secure. Sufficient is thine arm alone, and our defense is sure. Before the hills in order stood, or earth received her frame, from everlasting thou art God, to endless years the same. 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone, short as the watch that ends the night before the rising sun. Our God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. Be thou our guard while troubles last, and our eternal home.